The first snowfall of winter descended on Millhaven like a hesitant apology, soft flakes melting against the weathered pavement of Fulton Street. Margaret Whelan pulled her tattered wool coat tighter around her shoulders, the fabric worn thin from years of service, much like her spirit. 3 days had passed since the shelter turned her away. Overcrowded, they'd said, and the bitter November air seemed determined to find every gap in her defenses. Wind whistled through the alley, where she'd arranged her few possessions with mathematical precision. A folded tarpaulin for ground cover, a frayed sleeping bag, still bearing the faded logo of her daughter's college, a backpack containing everything she couldn't bear to part with, photographs, a dog-eared paper bag, and the business card of a social worker who'd promised a call about housing. 2 months ago, at 62, Margaret's hands bore the knotted evidence of rheumatoid arthritis, the same affliction that had eventually cost her the seamstress position at Brierley's department store after 34 years of service. The severance hadn't stretched far, not with the medications and the rent increases. Then came the eviction notice, followed by weeks of sleeping in her car until it, too, was repossessed. "Not how I pictured my golden years," she murmured, arranging newspaper beneath her sleeping bag for additional insulation. Pride had kept her from reaching out to her daughter in Arizona. Melissa had her own struggles, a new baby, a husband recently laid off. Margaret refused to become another burden. The distant rumble reached her ears before the vibration traveled through the pavement. Motorcycles. Margaret tensed. The alley behind O'Malley's bar wasn't her first choice of shelter, but the overhang provided protection from the snow, and the kitchen vents released periodic blasts of warm air that smelled of fried onions and comfort. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by the squeal of brakes and raucous male laughter. Motorcycle engines cut off in sequence, followed by the heavy thud of boots on asphalt. The weekend crowd arriving at O'Malley's, the Iron Disciples Motorcycle Club, if their Thursday night pattern held true. Margaret huddled deeper into her corner, hoping to remain invisible. The back door of the bar swung open, spilling golden light and classic rock into the night. Margaret watched as men in leather jackets adorned with patches filed into the building, their breath clouding in the cold air. One man lingered outside, a mountain of a figure with a salt and pepper beard that reached the middle of his chest. In the dim light, Margaret could make out the words Iron Disciples MC and President embroidered on the back of his jacket. He lit a cigarette, the flame from his lighter briefly illuminating a face lined with years of hard living. Margaret shifted slightly, and the movement caught his attention. His head turned toward her hiding spot, eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the shadows. "Who's there?" His voice was gravel-wrapped in smoke. Margaret remained still, but a sudden cough betrayed her, her chest tight from the cold and the beginnings of what would likely become bronchitis without proper shelter. The man took a step toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to his hip. "I said, who's there?" "Nobody," Margaret answered, her voice weak but carrying an edge of defiance. "Just an old woman trying to stay warm." "I'm not looking for trouble." The biker approached cautiously, towering over her makeshift camp. His expression shifted from suspicion to something unreadable as he took in her situation. Margaret met his gaze without flinching, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "This ain't a good place to sleep, lady," he said, flicking his cigarette into a puddle, where it died with a hiss. "Bar gets rowdy on Thursdays." "I'm aware," Margaret replied, her teacher's diction incongruous with her surroundings. "But beggars quite literally cannot be choosers. The shelters are full." The man studied her for a long moment. "You hungry?" The question caught her off guard. Pride warred with hunger, and hunger won. "Yes," he nodded once. "Wait here." He disappeared inside the bar, leaving Margaret to wonder if she'd just made a terrible mistake. 5 minutes passed before the door swung open again. The biker returned with a styrofoam container and a steaming cup. He crouched down, a surprisingly fluid movement for such a large man, and offered them to Margaret. "Burger, fries, and coffee. It ain't fancy, but it's hot." Margaret hesitated only briefly before accepting. "Thank you, Mr. Holt." "Ray Holt." He straightened up, wincing slightly as his knee popped. "You got a name?" "Margaret Whelan." She opened the container, the aroma of food making her dizzy with anticipation. Ray watched as she took a careful bite of the burger. "How long you been out here, Margaret? On the street?" "4 months." "In this particular alley?" "3 days." She took a sip of coffee, savoring the warmth as it spread through her chest. "I'm between situations at the moment." A ghost of a smile touched Ray's weathered face. That's one way to put it. Margaret ate methodically, preserving half the burger for later despite her hunger. Old habits of rationing had become second nature. "The boys and I are heading out soon," Ray said, glancing at the sky as the snowfall intensified. "Temperature's dropping." "You got someplace to go?" "I'll manage," Margaret said, wrapping the remaining food carefully. "I always do." Ray frowned. "It's gonna be 15 degrees tonight, hence the newspapers." Margaret gestured to her makeshift bedding. "I've become quite resourceful." The back door opened again and a younger biker with a shaved head poked out. "Ray, we're waiting on you, man." "Meeting's starting. Be there in a minute, Dex." Ray waved him off, then turned back to Margaret. "Listen, there's a place about 3 blocks from here. Church basement. St. Andrew's. They open up when it gets below freezing. Not a shelter exactly, but they'll let you sleep in the pews." Margaret nodded slowly. "I'm aware of St. Andrew's. Unfortunately, their policy requires guests to arrive before 8. It's nearly 9:30 now." Ray considered this, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a cell phone. He dialed a number and turned slightly away. "Father Mike?" "Yeah, it's Ray Holt. Sorry to call so late." A pause. "Yeah, good to hear you too. Listen, I got a situation." Ray walked a few paces away, his voice dropping too low for Margaret to hear. After a brief conversation, he returned to Margaret. "It's arranged. Father Mike will meet you at the side door in 20 minutes. They'll have a cot set up in the office. It's small, but it's warm." Margaret stared at him, suspicion and gratitude waging war in her mind. "Why would you do this for me?" Ray's expression darkened momentarily. "My mother died under a highway overpass in Pittsburgh, January 1992. Nobody helped her." He cleared his throat. "We can give you a ride to the church." Before Margaret could respond, the door banged open again, and 3 more bikers spilled out, their laughter cutting through the quiet night. "Ray, what the hell, man? Dex said you were out here, but the meetings—" The speaker, a tall man with a braided goatee, stopped short when he spotted Margaret. "Who's the bag lady?" Margaret felt herself stiffen at the casual cruelty of the words. "Show some respect, weasel," Ray said, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. The one called Weasel held up his hands in mock surrender, but his smirk remained. "Sorry, didn't know we were running a charity." He glanced at Margaret's meager possessions. "You adopting strays now, Ray?" A younger biker with a sleeve of tattoos snickered. "Careful, might catch something." The third man, older than the others, nudged the tattooed biker and muttered, "Shut up, knife." Margaret rose to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster, her knees protesting the movement. "I've imposed enough on Mr. Holt's kindness. Please, return to your meeting." She began gathering her things with trembling hands. "Leave your stuff," Ray said. "Dex will bring it in the truck when he gives you a ride to St. Andrews." "That's my job now?" Dex asked, looking between Ray and Margaret with undisguised annoyance. "Chauffeur for the homeless?" Something in Margaret snapped. 4 months of indignities, of becoming invisible to passers-by, of being spoken about, rather than to... It all crystallized into a sudden white-hot anger. "Don't trouble yourself," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had once silenced unruly 9th graders. "I'd rather walk than be an inconvenience to such upstanding citizens." Weasel laughed. "Lady's got a mouth on her." Margaret turned to face the group, drawing herself up to her full height of 5'3". "What I have, young man, is enough respect for myself not to be belittled by men who dress like outlaws, but probably file tax returns and have mortgages." She shouldered her backpack. "You wear your costumes and play at being dangerous because it makes you feel important, when in reality, you're just weekend warriors with loud machines and louder voices." The alley fell silent. Knife's face darkened. "You calling us fake?" Margaret looked him squarely in the eye. I'm calling you exactly what you are, trash with motorcycles. Weasel took a menacing step forward. You don't know who you're talking to, lady. I know precisely who I'm talking to, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Men who feel powerful intimidating an elderly homeless woman. How very brave of you. Ray moved between Margaret and the others. That's enough. You gonna let her talk to us like that? Knife demanded. I just did, Ray said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Now get back inside. Tell the others I'll be there in 5. The 3 men hesitated, but something in Ray's posture must have convinced them to retreat. They filed back into the bar, Weasel throwing one last glare over his shoulder before the door closed behind them. In the sudden quiet, Margaret's bravado deserted her. She swayed slightly on her feet, exhaustion and stress taking their toll. Ray caught her elbow to steady her. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've seen in a while. Margaret gave a weak laugh. Perhaps both. I apologize for insulting your friends. They'll live, Ray said dryly. He looked at the snowflakes accumulating on her gray hair. You still need to get to St. Andrews. I'll manage on my own, Margaret said, gently withdrawing her arm from his grasp. You've done more than enough, Mr. Holt. Ray studied her for a moment, then sighed heavily. Stubborn woman. He turned toward the bar. Wait here. Don't leave. Before she could protest, he disappeared inside again. Margaret considered simply walking away, but the thought of the warmth waiting at St. Andrews kept her rooted to the spot. She was so tired of being cold. When Ray returned, he was wearing a heavy leather jacket with sheepskin lining. He handed Margaret a knitted beanie. Put this on. Your ears are turning blue. Margaret accepted the hat, unable to remember the last time someone had shown concern for her comfort. As she pulled it over her head, Ray spoke into a handheld radio. Dex, bring the truck around back, and grab her things. He returned the radio to his belt and looked at Margaret. Meeting's postponed. I'm taking you to St. Andrews myself. Your friends won't be happy, Margaret observed. They're not my friends, Ray said matter-of-factly. They're my responsibility. Different thing entirely. He offered his arm. Truck's heated, and Dex makes a decent cup of hot chocolate if you ask nice. A black pickup with oversized tires rounded the corner of the building. Dex emerged, looking decidedly unhappy as he gathered Margaret's possessions. This isn't necessary, Margaret protested weakly, even as she allowed Ray to guide her toward the truck. Yes, it is, Ray said. Because I know something those boys don't. What's that? Ray opened the passenger door for her. That any one of us is one bad decision or stroke of bad luck away from being exactly where you are. As Margaret settled into the warm cab of the truck, Dex climbed into the back seat, passing a thermos forward. Hot chocolate. Ray said you might want it. Margaret accepted the thermos, unscrewing the cap to inhale the sweet aroma. Thank you, Dex. The young man grunted in acknowledgement, but something in his expression had softened slightly. Ray started the engine. St. Andrews first. Then we'll figure out something more permanent tomorrow. I don't understand, Margaret said, wrapping her stiff fingers around the thermos. Why are you doing all this? Ray pulled out onto the main road, windshield wipers sweeping away the falling snow. The Iron Disciples started as a group of Vietnam vets who couldn't adjust to civilian life. Over the years, it became something else, something my father wouldn't recognize. But the original mission was simple. Look out for those who have no one else. Margaret took a small sip of the hot chocolate. Is that still your mission, Mr. Holt? It's my mission, Ray answered, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The club's lost its way a bit, too concerned with territory and respect. He glanced at her briefly. But sometimes it takes someone with courage to remind us who we're supposed to be. I called you trash, Margaret reminded him, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Ray's laugh was unexpected, a deep, genuine sound that filled the cab. That you did, and those boys needed to hear it. He turned onto a side street, the church steeple visible ahead. Sometimes the truth hurts, Margaret. Doesn't make it any less true. Dex leaned forward from the back seat. For what it's worth, I thought it was pretty badass. Nobody talks to Weasel like that. Margaret found herself smiling for what felt like the first time in months. Well, perhaps someone should have before now. The truck pulled up to the side entrance of St. Andrew's, where a gray-haired man in a clerical collar stood waiting under an umbrella. Ray turned to Margaret, his expression serious once more. Tomorrow, I'm bringing some of the guys who actually get what the disciples are supposed to stand for. We're going to help you figure things out. Housing, benefits, whatever you need. Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Why? Because that's what we do, Ray said simply, or what we should be doing. He opened his door and circled around to help her out. And because you had the guts to call us on our hypocrisy, that deserves something in return. As they walked toward the church entrance, Margaret found her voice again. I may have judged your group too harshly, Mr. Holt. Ray, he corrected. And no, you sized us up pretty accurately, but maybe you can help us remember what we're supposed to stand for. Father Mike greeted them with a warm smile. Margaret? I'm Mike Donovan. Ray tells me you could use a place to stay tonight. As she was escorted inside, Margaret looked back at Ray and Dex standing in the swirling snow, their imposing figures at odds with the gentleness they'd shown her. I'll see you tomorrow, Ray called. 9 o'clock. We've got work to do. For the first time since losing her apartment, Margaret allowed herself to feel something dangerous. Hope. She lifted her hand in farewell, watching as the two bikers returned to their truck. Perhaps there was more to these men than their patches and attitudes suggested. Perhaps there was more to her own story than she had believed. The church door closed behind her, shutting out the cold and the darkness. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the unknown. But tonight, Margaret Whelan would sleep warm, with a full stomach and the memory of being seen, truly seen, after months of invisibility. And somewhere in the snowy night, a group of bikers was about to have a long overdue conversation about what it really meant to be Iron disciples. The second dawn after the snowfall broke over Millhaven with surprising clarity, the air crisp and clean as Margaret made her way down the church steps. Her breath clouded before her as she adjusted the scarf Ray had brought for her yesterday. Cashmere, he'd said, though Margaret suspected it had once belonged to someone special in his life. He'd offered it with such casual nonchalance that refusing would have seemed ungracious. Father Mike followed her outside, his kind face creased with concern. You're sure about this, Margaret? You're welcome to stay longer. The office couch pulls out to a proper bed. Margaret smiled, patting his arm. You've been more than generous, Mike. But I've imposed enough. She glanced toward the street where Ray's truck idled at the curb, a small cloud of exhaust rising in the cold morning air. Besides, it seems I have appointments to keep. Ray Holt is... Father Mike seemed to choose his words carefully. A complicated man, but his heart is in the right place. I'm beginning to see that, Margaret replied. True to his word, Ray had returned to St. Andrew's the previous morning, accompanied by 3 other Iron disciples, older men with weathered faces, who introduced themselves as Bones, Doc, and Steele. They'd spent hours helping Margaret navigate the bureaucratic maze of social services, with Doc, a former hospital administrator before his retirement, proving particularly adept at cutting through red tape. By afternoon, they'd secured her an emergency housing voucher and an appointment with a rheumatologist at the county clinic. Steele, who worked as a mechanic, had contacts at the local senior center's transportation program. He'd arranged for Margaret to be added to their ride service roster, while Bones, a taciturn man with surprisingly gentle hands, had repaired the broken zipper on her sleeping bag and reinforced the straps of her backpack. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Father Mike observed, watching as Ray stepped out of his truck and headed toward them, his heavy boots crunching on the salt-strewn sidewalk. Indeed, he does, Margaret agreed. Through the most unexpected vessels, Ray nodded a greeting as he approached, his breath visible in the morning air. Ready? As I'll ever be, Margaret replied, adjusting her grip on her backpack. Father Mike embraced her briefly. Remember, our door is always open to you, Margaret. Thank you for everything, she said, the words inadequate for the kindness he'd shown. Ray took her backpack with a gentleness that belied his imposing figure, and Margaret followed him to the truck. Today, instead of Dex in the back seat, there was a woman, perhaps in her 50s, with copper hair streaked with silver and sharp, assessing eyes. "Margaret, this is Ellie," Ray said as he helped Margaret into the passenger seat. "My sister. She runs the shelter over in Havenbrook." Ellie leaned forward, offering a hand tipped with short, practical nails. "Ray's told me about you. Sounds like you gave him and the boys a much-needed reality check." Margaret flushed slightly. "I fear I was rather harsh in my assessment." "Sometimes harsh is what's needed," Ellie said with a knowing smile. "Ray mentioned you were a teacher. 9th grade English for 30 years. Then I took a position as a seamstress when the arthritis made writing on the blackboard too painful." Margaret flexed her gnarled fingers unconsciously. "Interesting," Ellie said, exchanging a glance with her brother as he started the engine. "We happen to be looking for someone to teach basic literacy classes at the shelter. Twice a week, evenings. Pays a stipend. Nothing extravagant, but..." Margaret turned in her seat to face Ellie directly. "Are you offering me a job?" "More of a paid volunteer position," Ellie clarified. "But yes, many of our residents never finish school. Some are trying to get GEDs, fill out job applications, read to their kids. They need help." Ray guided the truck through Millhaven's quiet Sunday morning streets. "The studio apartment we found for you is 3 blocks from Ellie's shelter. Social Security and disability should come through within 6 weeks, Doc says. The teaching would supplement that." Margaret felt a curious lightness in her chest, the unfamiliar sensation of burdens being lifted rather than added. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Ellie suggested. "Come see the shelter, meet some of the residents. Then decide." They drove in comfortable silence for several minutes, the town giving way to a more industrial area before transitioning to what appeared to be a neighborhood in transition. Old warehouses being converted to lofts, small businesses reclaiming abandoned storefronts. Ray pulled up in front of a 4-story brick building with large windows. A sign above the entrance read, "Harlow Mill Apartments." "Here we are," he announced. "Your voucher's good for 3 months. By then, we'll have your benefits sorted, and you can transition to subsidized senior housing if you want." Margaret stared at the building, her mind struggling to process the rapid change in her circumstances. Just 3 days ago, she'd been preparing to spend another night in a freezing alley. "I don't understand why you're doing all this," she said finally, turning to Ray. He cut the engine and rested his hands on the steering wheel. "When I was 19, I was angry at the world. Vietnam was chewing up boys like me and spitting them out in boxes. I enlisted anyway, figured I'd rather choose my fate than wait for the draft." His eyes took on a faraway look. "When I got home, I was different. Couldn't adjust. Found the only people who understood were other vets. The disciples started as a support group, basically. Guys riding together, watching each other's backs." Ellie picked up the thread of the story. "Our father was one of the founders. Iron, Mike Holt. The club was named after something their chaplain used to say, that they were disciples with iron in their spines, but compassion in their hearts. Somewhere along the way, the younger guys forgot about the compassion part." Ray continued, "Started caring more about looking tough than being strong in the ways that matter." Margaret considered this. "And my comments the other night reminded me of something Dad would have said." Ray's weathered face softened momentarily. He never tolerated posturing or cruelty. The disciples were supposed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. Ellie opened her door. "Let's get you settled in, Margaret. I brought some basics. Linens, toiletries, a few groceries. The boys will bring your furniture this afternoon." "Furniture?" Margaret repeated, bewildered. "Nothing fancy," Ray assured her as they exited the truck. "Bed, table, couple of chairs. Doc's daughter was moving and had some pieces she was going to donate anyway. We just redirected them." The apartment was on the 2nd floor, a modest studio with worn but clean hardwood floors, a small kitchenette, and windows that flooded the space with morning light. Margaret moved slowly through the room, touching the countertop, looking out at the view of a small community garden across the street. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice catching. Ellie busied herself unpacking a box of supplies in the kitchenette, while Ray brought up Margaret's few possessions. "Bathroom's basic, but everything works," Ellie called over her shoulder. "Super lives downstairs, Mr. Abernathy." Good man, former Marine. Ray's already talked to him about helping with minor repairs. Margaret sank onto the windowsill, suddenly overwhelmed. I don't know how I'll ever repay you both. Ray set her backpack down carefully. You don't have to. But I want to, Margaret insisted. I'm not accustomed to charity. It's not charity, Ray said firmly. It's community. One day, you'll help someone else. That's how it works. Ellie approached with a mug of tea, which she pressed into Margaret's hands. Besides, we need someone with your perspective. Ray's been talking about refocusing the club on community service, the way it was intended. Your experience could be valuable. Margaret took a sip of tea, allowing the warmth to spread through her. My experience as a homeless person, you mean? As a survivor, Ray corrected. Someone who maintained her dignity and courage in impossible circumstances. The kind of strength the younger guys pretend to have but don't understand. A knock at the open door drew their attention. Dex stood in the hallway, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. Behind him, Weasel and Knife waited, unusually subdued. We, brought some stuff, Dex said, holding up a bag from a local department store. Curtains, and a lamp. Margaret set down her tea and approached the doorway. That's very thoughtful, Dex. Thank you. Weasel cleared his throat. Ray explained some things, about the club's history and all. He wouldn't meet Margaret's eyes. Anyway, we wanted to say sorry for how we acted. Knife nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. My grandma raised me better than that. Margaret studied the three young men for a long moment. Apology accepted, though I should apologize as well for my harsh words. Nah, Dex said with a hint of a smile. We deserved it. Ray joined them at the door. The boys are going to help set up the furniture when it arrives. Then they're signed up for the shelter's maintenance day. Roof needs patching before winter really sets in. Knife's eyebrows shot up in surprise at this news, but a sharp look from Weasel silenced any protest. Happy to help, Weasel said, his sincerity questionable but his compliance evident. As the younger men retreated to wait downstairs, Ellie touched Margaret's arm gently. Rest. Settle in. I'll come by tomorrow to show you the shelter if you're feeling up to it. I'd like that, Margaret said. The prospect of being useful again, of having purpose, was almost as welcome as the apartment itself. Ray lingered as Ellie headed for the stairs. One more thing. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to Margaret. From the club's emergency fund. It's not much, but it'll help until your first benefits check comes. Margaret took the envelope without opening it. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Ray assured her. Just be around sometimes, to remind us who we're supposed to be. After they'd gone, Margaret stood in the center of her new apartment, hardly daring to believe the turn her life had taken. The walls needed paint, the floors needed polishing, but it was shelter, a place to begin again. She opened the envelope Ray had given her. Inside was a modest sum of cash and a handwritten note. Iron in our spines, compassion in our hearts. Welcome to the family. Margaret Whelan smoothed the note with her arthritic fingers and placed it on the windowsill where the morning sun illuminated the words. Outside, she could see Ray and the others unloading furniture from a truck. Dex was laughing at something Knife had said. Weasel was taking direction from Ellie, with surprising deference. Family. It wasn't a word Margaret had applied to anyone but her distant daughter in a very long time. Yet, here it was, taking shape before her eyes, unexpected, unconventional, but undeniably real. She picked up her mug of tea and raised it in a silent toast to the future unfolding below her window. 3 days ago, she'd called a group of bikers trash to their faces. Today, they were proving her gloriously, wonderfully wrong, and in the process, helping her rediscover her own worth. The snow had stopped, the sky was clear, and for the first time in months, Margaret Whelan felt the ice around her heart beginning to thaw. 6 months later, the community garden across from Harlow Mill Apartments burst with early summer color. Margaret moved slowly between the raised beds, her arthritic knees still troublesome, but responding well to the new medication Dr. Wasserman had prescribed. She paused to deadhead a cluster of marigolds, dropping the spent blooms into the basket on her arm. Thought I'd find you out here, a familiar voice called. Margaret straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun. Ray Holt stood at the garden gate, helmet tucked under one arm. In the months since their first meeting, his beard had been trimmed and threaded with more silver, but his presence remained as commanding as ever. "The tomatoes needed attention," Margaret explained, gesturing toward the flourishing plants staked along the back fence. "And I promised Mrs. Abernathy I'd collect flowers for her daughter's graduation party." Ray unlatched the gate and entered the garden, his heavy boots incongruous among the delicate greenery. "Ellie said to remind you about the literacy program fundraiser tonight. 6 o'clock. "As if I could forget," Margaret replied, a smile warming her features. "I've been practicing my speech all week." The transformation in Margaret's life had unfolded with quiet determination since that snowy November night. The teaching position at Ellie's shelter had evolved into a structured program, with Margaret coordinating a small team of volunteers who provided not just literacy instruction, but GED preparation and job application assistance. 3 of her first students had since found employment, and one, a young mother named Tasha, had recently enrolled in community college. "Nervous?" Ray asked, stooping to examine a particularly robust tomato plant. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "I haven't addressed a crowd since my retirement party from Westridge High." She transferred a handful of zinnias to her basket. "But Ellie assures me that potential donors are more likely to open their checkbooks when they see a success story in the flesh." Ray straightened, brushing soil from his hands. "You're more than just a success story, Margaret." "I know," she said softly. The months had restored not just her circumstances, but her sense of self. The hollow-eyed woman who had huddled in an alley was becoming a distant memory, though Margaret made a point of never forgetting how quickly security could evaporate. "How was your meeting with the chapter presidents?" Ray's expression brightened. "Better than expected. 3 more chapters are implementing community service requirements. The Havenbrook disciples already renovated 2 apartments in the transitional housing complex, and the Millhaven crew is starting a mentorship program with the high school next month." The Iron disciples had undergone their own transformation parallel to Margaret's. Ray's renewed commitment to the club's founding principles had met resistance from some quarters, but surprising support from others. The older members, particularly those who remembered Iron Mike Holt, had rallied behind his vision. Younger writers like Dex had embraced the change, finding purpose in the balance between brotherhood and service. "And Weasel?" Margaret inquired, knowing that Ray's most vocal opponent had been a particular challenge. "Gone to start his own club with a few others." Ray's tone was matter-of-fact, rather than bitter. "Best for everyone, really. The disciples aren't for everyone anymore, not since we remembered what we stand for." Margaret gathered a few more flowers before picking up her basket. "I should get these in water before they wilt. Would you like some tea? I made scones this morning." "Can't turn down your scones," Ray said, falling into step beside her as they exited the garden. They crossed the street to Harlow Mill Apartments, now sporting a fresh coat of paint and window boxes filled with petunias. Mr. Abernathy waved from where he was showing a new tenant how to operate the recently installed security system. Margaret's studio had transformed along with her life. Curtains that Dex had selected now framed windows that overlooked the garden. Bookshelves, built by Bones and his apprentice, a recovering addict named Tyler, lined one wall, filled with volumes donated by the local library and Father Mike's congregation. A refurbished sewing machine occupied a small table by the window, evidence of Margaret's gradually returning dexterity. As she arranged the flowers in a vase, Ray settled into what had become his chair, a worn leather recliner that had mysteriously appeared in her apartment one day, delivered by Doc and Steele with no explanation beyond it was taking up space in the clubhouse. "How's Melissa?" Ray asked, accepting the mug of tea Margaret offered. "Doing well, planning to visit next month with the baby." Margaret's reconciliation with her daughter had been gradual, initiated by a phone call shortly after moving into the apartment, sustained by weekly conversations that had slowly bridged the distance between them. "She's curious to meet everyone, especially you." Ray's weathered face creased in a rare smile. "I'll be on my best behavior." "That would be a disappointment," Margaret replied with a teasing glint in her eye. I've told her all about your colorful vocabulary. Their easy banter was interrupted by a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find Knife, now going by his given name, Anthony, standing in the hallway with a nervous expression. "Sorry to interrupt, Mrs. W.," he said, still struggling with the formality Margaret had insisted upon. "But there's a situation at the shelter. Ellie asked if you could come." Margaret glanced at Ray, who was already rising from his chair. "What kind of situation, Anthony?" "New family just arrived. Mother with 3 kids. They've been living in their car since they got evicted last week." Anthony shifted uncomfortably. "The youngest one, girl about 6, won't talk to anyone. Hiding under a table. Ellie thought maybe you could help, since you're good with the scared ones." Margaret set down her tea. "Of course. Let me get my sweater." Minutes later, they were in Ray's truck heading toward Havenbrook, a journey that had become familiar over the past months. Anthony followed on his motorcycle, the club patches on his jacket now accompanied by a new rocker that read, "Community Service Officer." "Think of it as practice for your speech tonight," Ray suggested as they drove. "One scared child at a time instead of a room full of potential donors." Margaret nodded, her mind already focused on the task ahead. Fear is fear, whether you're 6 or 60. Sometimes all people need is someone who understands how quickly the ground can disappear beneath your feet. Ray glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, the first night we met, when you called us trash, I was angry as hell." "I remember," Margaret said dryly. "But after I cooled down, I realized something." Ray navigated through a busy intersection. "You were the first person in years who didn't see the patches and the bikes and immediately either fear us or kiss our asses. You just saw men, flawed men, acting badly. Trash with motorcycles." Margaret quoted herself with a hint of embarrassment. Exactly, and it was true. Ray's voice took on a reflective quality. "Dad used to say that a man's true character shows in how he treats people who can't do anything for him. By that measure, we were failing miserably that night." They pulled into the shelter parking lot, where Ellie stood waiting at the entrance. The brick building, once a small factory, had been transformed by the disciples' labor over the winter months. New windows gleamed in the sunshine, the roof no longer leaked, and a small playground occupied what had once been a loading dock. As Margaret exited the truck, she paused to straighten her cardigan, the gesture an unconscious echo of the dignity she had maintained even in her darkest hours. "You know, Ray, by that same measure, you've more than redeemed yourself." Ray shook his head. "Not looking for redemption, just trying to live up to the promise of the patch." He touched the emblem on his jacket briefly. "Iron in our spines, compassion in our hearts." Margaret smiled at the motto that had become familiar to her over the months. "Well, let's put that compassion to work, shall we?" "There's a frightened child waiting." Together, they walked toward the shelter, the former teacher and the biker president, an unlikely alliance forged in an alley on a snowy night when one woman's courage had met another's forgotten conscience. Behind them, Anthony killed his motorcycle's engine and joined them at the entrance. Other disciples were already inside, helping unload donations or repairing playground equipment. The club's transformation remained a work in progress, but the direction was clear. As Margaret Whelan stepped into the shelter to help another woman navigate the terrifying journey she herself had walked, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes family finds you in the most unexpected places, and that even in the darkest moments, a single voice speaking truth can change not just one life, but many. And sometimes, when the world is quick to label people as disposable, as trash, all it takes is one person to see beyond the surface to the human worth beneath. One person to remember that everyone has a story, everyone has value, and everyone deserves a second chance. Even a homeless woman with nothing left but her dignity. Even a biker who had forgotten his purpose. Even a frightened child hiding under a table. All waiting to be truly seen. All capable of transformation. All worthy of compassion. Iron in